The fifth day of the Middle East War arrived with a reality no one expected. What began as a regional confrontation was now spiraling into a global crisis. Iran had unleashed waves of missiles and drones against Israeli and American targets across the Gulf. Explosions echoed across military bases. Radar stations lit up with incoming threats. And air defense systems worked without pause. But something far more alarming was unfolding beneath the surface of these attacks. For the first time since the conflict began, the battlefield was no longer limited to the Middle East. The war was expanding. And the shock came when reports confirmed that Iranian-linked drone strikes had reached European territory. An EU member state had suddenly found itself pulled into the center of a war that was originally thousands of kilometers away. At the same time, the United States launched a massive naval operation that crippled Iran's maritime forces. According to CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper, U.S. forces had already destroyed 17 Iranian warships, including one of Iran's most operational submarines. Iran's naval power in the Gulf was being systematically dismantled. Yet the destruction of Iran's fleet did not calm the situation. Instead, it triggered something even more dangerous. Iran responded with a move that could shake the entire global economy. The Strait of Hormuz, the most critical oil artery in the world, was suddenly closed. Nearly 20 million barrels of oil per day normally pass through this narrow waterway. Now, it had become a battlefield. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Navy issued a chilling warning. No ship of any type would be allowed to pass through the strait until further notice. Within hours, maritime traffic collapsed. Satellite tracking data revealed that tanker movement had dropped by nearly 80%. Hundreds of vessels were suddenly stranded in open waters. Oil tankers, cargo ships, and logistics vessels were forced to anchor, unable to move. Then came the moment everyone feared. Missile and drone attacks began targeting commercial ships. Several oil tankers were damaged. One sailor lost his life. And as chaos spread across the Gulf, more than 700 ships were left trapped inside the Strait of Hormuz. The world was now watching one of the most critical choke points of global trade descend into complete paralysis. But this was only the beginning of the crisis. Because while the Gulf was burning, something even more unexpected was about to happen in the Mediterranean. And the man about to change the entire balance of power was sitting in Paris. French President Emmanuel Macron. While chaos spread across the Strait of Hormuz, a completely different development was taking shape thousands of kilometers away. In Paris, the French government was watching the crisis escalate minute by minute. For days, Europe had remained mostly cautious, issuing statements and monitoring the situation without direct military involvement. But that silence did not last. Late on the evening of March 3, French President Emmanuel Macron appeared on national television with a message that stunned military analysts across the world. France was mobilizing. Not diplomatically. Not symbolically. Militarily. Macron announced that France's nuclear-powered aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle and its entire carrier strike group had been urgently deployed toward the eastern Mediterranean. This was not a routine naval movement. It was one of the most powerful military formations Europe could send. The decision immediately transformed the geopolitical situation. The Charles de Gaulle is the only nuclear-powered aircraft carrier in Europe. When deployed with its full strike group, it becomes a floating air base capable of projecting enormous military power across an entire region. On board the carrier are 30 Rafale M fighter jets, along with early warning aircraft, helicopters, and advanced command systems. But the aircraft carrier was only the centerpiece. Escorting the carrier were several advanced warships designed to defend the fleet against missiles, drones, and submarines. Among them was the Aquitaine-class air defense frigate, equipped with powerful radar systems and Aster missile interceptors capable of destroying aerial threats at long range. This fleet had originally been participating in NATO exercises near Sweden in the Baltic Sea. But the moment the crisis escalated, Paris made a dramatic decision. The entire strike group was immediately redirected south. Its destination, the Mediterranean. According to Macron, the mission was clear. France would act to protect maritime trade routes and defend European security interests as tensions spread beyond the Middle East. But behind this official explanation, analysts believed there was another message. Europe was no longer willing to remain a passive observer. For the first time since the war began, a European power was stepping directly into the strategic arena. And the timing was no coincidence. Because just days earlier, something had happened that shocked the European Union. A drone strike had hit a British military base in Cyprus. Suddenly, the war was no longer distant. It was knocking on Europe's door. And France had decided to respond. Yet what made Macron's decision even more surprising was something else he said in the same speech. Despite deploying powerful military forces, the French president openly criticized the earlier US and Israeli strikes on Iran, calling them actions that violated international law. It was a complex message. France was sending warships. But it was also signaling independence. Paris was entering the crisis on its own terms. And the arrival of the Charles de Gaulle in the Mediterranean was about to change the strategic balance of the entire region. However, France was not the only country preparing for what might come next. Because Greece was about to make its own move, France's dramatic military deployment did not remain an isolated move for long. As the aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle moved toward the eastern Mediterranean, another European country quickly stepped forward to reinforce the region. That country was Greece. Athens understood something very clearly. If the war spreading from the Middle East reached the Mediterranean, Cyprus would become one of the first pressure points. And Cyprus sits only a few hundred kilometers from several active military hotspots in the region. For Greece, the security of Cyprus is deeply connected to its own national security. So Athens decided to act. The Greek government announced the immediate deployment of additional naval and air forces to support defensive operations around Cyprus. 2 Greek frigates were dispatched to patrol the surrounding waters. Alongside them, 4 F-16 fighter jets were sent to reinforce aerial surveillance and interception capabilities over the island. But one of the most notable ships in this fleet attracted particular attention from military analysts. It was the newly commissioned FDI hydrogen nitride-class frigate HS Kimin. This warship represents one of the most advanced surface combatants currently operating in the Mediterranean. Built with cutting-edge radar systems and powerful missile defense capabilities, the frigate was designed specifically to counter modern aerial threats such as drones and cruise missiles. By deploying this ship, Greece was sending a clear signal. Europe was beginning to form a defensive shield. Soon the waters around Cyprus started to fill with NATO-aligned naval patrols. Air defense coverage expanded across the region. Military aircraft flew regular patrol routes. Surveillance systems monitored every movement in the eastern Mediterranean. For the first time since the crisis began, the area was slowly shifting from vulnerability toward controlled defense. Meanwhile, the government of Cyprus tried to calm fears that the island was becoming part of the conflict. Cyprus President Nikos Christodoulidis publicly emphasized that Cyprus had no intention of joining the war and would not participate in any offensive actions. However, he also welcomed the support provided by France and Greece. Their presence, he explained, was necessary to protect the island and maintain stability. For Europe, the situation had become clear. The conflict was no longer a distant Middle Eastern war. It had reached the doorstep of the Mediterranean. And if it continued to escalate, the economic consequences could be devastating. Because while Europe was building a defensive line near Cyprus, the global energy system was already beginning to break under the pressure of the crisis. Major energy facilities were shutting down. Oil production was collapsing. And supply chains across the world were starting to feel the shock. The chaos that began in the Strait of Hormuz was now spreading into the global economy. While European forces were building a defensive shield in the Mediterranean, the economic shock of the war was spreading rapidly across the world. The crisis that began with missile strikes and naval clashes was now evolving into something far more dangerous. A global energy disruption. The first warning sign came from Qatar. following the escalating Iranian attacks and the growing instability around the Strait of Hormuz. Qatar made a dramatic decision that shocked energy markets. Operations at Ras Laffan, the largest liquefied natural gas facility in the world, were suddenly halted. This was not a minor facility. Ras Laffan is responsible for a massive portion of the global LNG supply. Nearly 25% of the world's liquefied natural gas exports pass through the Strait of Hormuz. And now production was stopping. Qatar Energy announced that not only gas production had been halted, but also multiple industrial sectors connected to the facility. Production of urea, polymers, methanol, and aluminum was suspended. These materials are essential components for global agriculture, manufacturing, and chemical industries. The shutdown created immediate shockwaves across global supply chains. But Qatar was not the only country facing serious disruptions. In Iraq, another major crisis was unfolding. The country was forced to halt production at the Rumaila oil field, the second largest oil field in the world. Storage facilities had reached their maximum capacity because oil exports through the Gulf were slowing dramatically. As a result, nearly 1.5 million barrels of oil per day were suddenly removed from the global market. At the same time, shipping companies were beginning to panic. Insurance premiums for vessels operating in the Gulf skyrocketed overnight. Some container lines made a drastic decision. Instead of passing through the Middle East, ships began rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa. This alternative route adds thousands of kilometers to the journey and significantly increases transportation costs. But for many shipping companies, it was safer than sailing into an active war zone. Energy markets reacted immediately. Oil prices surged toward $82 per barrel, and analysts warned that the number could climb even higher if the Strait of Hormuz remained blocked. And the risks were not limited to oil. If instability continued, other vital trade routes such as the Suez Canal and the Red Sea corridor could also face disruptions. The global economy was entering dangerous territory. But amid the growing chaos, one country was preparing a decisive response: the United States. And the plan coming from Washington was unlike anything seen before in the conflict. A massive naval escort operation designed to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. As the global economy began to feel the shock of the crisis, the United States made it clear that the paralysis of the Strait of Hormuz could not continue. Washington was now preparing a direct response. President Donald Trump announced a bold plan aimed at restoring maritime traffic through the most important oil corridor on the planet. The strategy was simple in theory but extremely complex in practice. The U.S. Navy would begin escorting oil tankers and commercial vessels through the Strait of Hormuz. Every convoy would move under the protection of American warships. In addition, the U.S. government promised financial guarantees and political risk insurance for ships willing to continue operating in the Gulf. This announcement sent a strong signal to global markets. The United States was preparing to reopen the strait by force if necessary. And the military assets already present in the region showed just how serious that plan was. In the Arabian Sea, the powerful USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group was already operating. Alongside the carrier, multiple warships had formed a large defensive formation. At least 6 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers were actively patrolling the area. Altogether, between 9 and 13 American warships were positioned across the region. Each destroyer carried an extraordinary level of firepower. These ships are equipped with 90 to 96 vertical launch system cells, capable of launching different types of advanced missiles. Many of these missiles are SM-6 and SM-2 interceptors, designed to destroy cruise missiles, drones, and even ballistic threats. A single destroyer can track and engage dozens of targets simultaneously. This is part of the famous Aegis combat system, one of the most advanced naval defense systems ever created. The convoy protection plan would likely operate in layers. Several destroyers would escort groups of tankers moving through the strait. Each convoy could include 5 to 10 oil tankers at a time. Multiple convoys could move through the area each day. However, there was a major challenge. More than 700 ships were currently stuck in the region. It would take time to clear that massive backlog. Priority would likely be given to the most valuable cargo ships, particularly crude oil tankers carrying energy supplies to global markets. The defense system protecting these convoys would operate through multiple layers. Long-range interceptors like the SM-6 could destroy incoming missiles before they even reached the fleet. Medium-range threats would be handled by SM-2 missiles. Closer dangers such as drones could be intercepted by ESSM missiles. Electronic warfare systems, and the Phalanx CIWS, the final defensive line of rapid-fire cannons. But even this powerful system had a serious weakness: cost. Iran's Shahed drones are extremely cheap to produce. Each one costs somewhere between $20,000 and $50. Meanwhile, a single SM-6 interceptor missile can cost $4 to $5 million. This creates a dangerous imbalance. Iran could launch swarms of cheap drones to force the United States and its allies to expend extremely expensive defense missiles. Military analysts call this strategy saturation warfare. And Iran had already demonstrated that it possessed massive stockpiles of drones and missiles. Thousands of them. This meant the conflict could easily become a battle of endurance. And if the United States focused too heavily on defensive escort missions, something else could happen. Its offensive strike capacity in the region might decrease. That is exactly why the arrival of France's aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean was becoming so important. Because it meant the burden of the crisis might soon be shared. But Iran was not finished yet. The country still possessed one of the largest missile and drone arsenals in the region. And the next phase of the conflict would depend on how, and when, Tehran decided to use it. Despite heavy losses to its navy and multiple airstrikes on its military infrastructure, Iran still possessed something extremely dangerous: a massive missile and drone arsenal. Military experts estimate that by early 2026, Iran still had between 2.000 and 2.500 ballistic missiles remaining in its inventory. This number had already been reduced during the earlier 12-day war and later strikes on February 28. Israeli and American forces reportedly destroyed hundreds of missile launchers across Iran. Israeli defense officials even claimed that nearly half of Iran's missile launch capability had been neutralized. But the remaining stockpile was still enormous. And Iran continued producing new missiles and drones inside underground facilities scattered across the country. Commanders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps claimed that thousands of missiles remained hidden inside fortified mountain bunkers. Some of these weapons were particularly alarming. Iran has been developing hypersonic missiles, capable of flying at speeds between 9.000 and 11.000 miles per hour. At those speeds, interception becomes extremely difficult. Air defense systems often have only seconds to react. And even then, the chances of successfully destroying the missile are limited. The only reliable method of stopping these weapons is destroying their launch sites before they are fired. But Iran had another advantage: mobility. Many of these missiles are launched from mobile transporter trucks that can move across the country and fire from temporary locations. This makes them incredibly difficult to detect and destroy. And Iran's drone arsenal is even larger. Cheap Shahed-type kamikaze drones have become one of Tehran's most effective tools. They are simple to build, easy to mass produce, and capable of flying long distances. Estimates suggest Iran possesses tens of thousands of these drones. During the first days of the war alone, Iran reportedly launched over 1.200 projectiles. Most of them were drones. This revealed Iran's strategy very clearly. Instead of relying only on expensive missiles, Iran planned to overwhelm enemy defenses by launching massive waves of inexpensive drones. Each drone might be cheap. But when hundreds or even thousands are launched simultaneously, they can saturate even the most advanced defense systems. This tactic forces defenders to choose between two bad options: either allow drones to pass through and risk damage, or fire extremely expensive missiles to intercept cheap targets. It is a classic strategy of asymmetric warfare. Iran understood that it could not match the United States and its allies in traditional military power. So instead, it aimed to exhaust them. Financially, operationally, and psychologically. But even with all these weapons, Iran still faced a major obstacle: the overwhelming naval and air power that the United States had assembled in the region. And if Washington decided to escalate further, the next stage of the war could become far more destructive than anything seen so far. As tensions continued rising across the Middle East and global markets trembled under the pressure of disrupted energy supplies, a powerful new force was moving toward the region: France's aircraft carrier strike group. At the center of this formation was the Charles de Gaulle, the only nuclear-powered aircraft carrier in Europe and one of the most capable naval platforms outside the United States. But what made this deployment so important was not just the ship itself. It was the timing. For weeks, the United States had carried the overwhelming burden of military operations in the region. American destroyers, fighter jets, and bombers had been responsible for defending shipping routes, intercepting drones, and striking Iranian targets. But maintaining such an intense level of military activity comes at a cost. Aircraft carriers, bombers, and missile defense systems require enormous logistical support. If the United States continued to operate alone, the strain on its forces would steadily increase. This is where France's arrival could change everything. The Charles de Gaulle Strike Group would bring dozens of additional aircraft and advanced air defense systems into the theater. Its Rafale M fighter jets are capable of performing both defensive and offensive missions, from intercepting drones to launching precision strikes against hostile targets. This means the French carrier could help cover airspace over large parts of the Mediterranean. And that would allow American forces to redistribute some of their resources. Instead of focusing entirely on defending shipping lanes in the Strait of Hormuz, the United States could regain some of its offensive flexibility. In other words, France's deployment could relieve part of the pressure on American forces. But the impact of this move is not only military. It is also political. By sending its most powerful naval asset into the region, France has signaled that Europe is no longer willing to remain on the sidelines of the crisis. For years, critics argued that Europe relied too heavily on the United States for security. Now, Paris appears to be challenging that perception. France is stepping forward as a strategic actor in the crisis. And if other European countries continue to support this effort, a broader European security presence could emerge in the Mediterranean. That would fundamentally change the strategic balance. However, despite these new deployments, one reality remains clear: the conflict is far from over. Even when the French carrier arrives, the attacks in the region are unlikely to stop overnight. Too many forces are now involved. Too many interests are at stake. And too much damage has already been done. The crisis that began with attacks in the Strait of Hormuz has now expanded across the Middle East, the Mediterranean, and even into Europe. What happens next will shape the geopolitical landscape for years to come. Closing segment. So the question now is simple. Will the arrival of France's aircraft carrier help stabilize the region? Or will the conflict continue to escalate into something even larger? Let us know what you think in the comments. Thank you for watching.